Congratulations, we have officially made it to our last literary period that we need to talk about. So from this point forward, we'll be focusing mostly on literary elements and the stories themselves. So postmodernism is the most recent literary period that we have identified and classified and looked at a set of characteristics for. So that's not to say that postmodernism is still the literary period that we're in. Most people think that we have moved on to a new literary period, but that we are too close to it to be able to name it and define it. All right, so let's go ahead and look to postmodernism. Actually, let's do a little review. So at this point, we have looked at Romanticism. Our buzzword there was optimism. Realism, buzzword, realism. Naturalism and pessimism go together. Modernism was a little more about fragmentation, alienation, and isolation. And our new literary period, modernism, postmodernism is a lot like modernism amplified. So you should be noticing a growing sense of pessimism, a growing bleakness in our literature and in the philosophy. And I'm sorry, I know you can't see that, but it's on the PDF version that I uploaded. So let's look at what sparked the change between modernism and realism. You probably already anticipated that it would be World War II. And World War II, similarly to World War I, just came with a massive amount of change to the world in almost every area. So if you look at this list of things that people were dealing with in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and I could have added information from the 70s and 80s and the 90s, and I didn't. I kind of stopped here because the literature we're reading mostly stops here. You're looking at the Holocaust. Certainly a shocking discovery for those who were not in Europe and unaware to see those images, to go through the Nuremberg trials, and to deal with the fact that humanity was capable of doing that to each other. We had the first attack on the United States in decades, the use of the atom bomb in Japan. Shortly after World War II ended, communism spread throughout Europe and Asia, which led to the Red Scare, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race. All of those things kind of go together in this fear of communism, how it would spread and how it was a threat to democracy, which of course would have been a major concern right on the heels of World War II, where democracy was just demolished in so many areas. All right, in the 1950s, society splits, and I'm sorry when I say society, I should be taking a more worldview, but I am focusing mostly on the states here. There are conservative, family-oriented values versus those who felt like they had been left out of the American dream, that it had been promised to them, but they weren't able to realize it. And you see this in things like the civil rights movement, beat poets, unions becoming popularized. And then, of course, we do have a rise in technology. Computers are introduced in the 1960s. The internet was created in the 60s. And then a few decades later, computers are such a part of daily life that it's impossible to envision life without them. So again, just a massive amount of change that takes the world by storm and starts to change how they see things. So let's look at what postmodernism actually is. It's a period that began with World War II, and it does overlap in time with modernism. It is a distinct era of its own, but that doesn't mean that everything in modernism was just thrown out. It is very similar in its themes and forms, except that instead of being confused and upset and disoriented by the chaos that's in the world, postmodernism starts to kind of celebrate that and seek that out, to look for the things that are absurd and crazy and make no sense, often things that are violent and chaotic, and pursue those. Just as a small example, the picture you have here is a Jackson Pollock, in which it just looks chaotic and people derive meaning or pleasure from this seeming randomness that he puts on a canvas. All right, so let's look how these two time periods are different. I was struggling with how to verbalize. Fortunately, I found this very helpful kind of infographic here. So on the left-hand side, you have modernism, right-hand side, you have postmodernism. And I know you can't see that bottom square, but again, it's visible in the PDF that I uploaded. So modernism prevalent in late 19th century, early 20th century. Postmodernism starts with the mid 20th century. Modernism influenced by World War I. Postmodernism, influenced by World War II. Modernism is based, and I think these are two very, very key distinctions with the worldview. And the last two are some key distinctions with the literature that comes out of that worldview. So modernism was based on using rational and logical means to gain knowledge, since they had rejected realism. So they were still going to try to scientifically figure out, why is mankind like this? Why do we act this way? Why is society like this? And do so in a logical manner, which is why you have psychology and Darwinism being important in that, and relevant in that time period. And then postmodernism is based mostly on scientific, irrational thought processes, and in many ways it rejects logical thinking. So instead of saying, well, there has to be an explanation for why the world is the way it is, or there must be a reason that I behave the way I do, or he behaves the way he does, they're thinking, no, that's just kind of the fact that life doesn't have meaning. Let's just embrace that idea. All right, so at the very bottom there in modernism, it says modernism rejected the conventional styles of prose and poetry. So they're trying to create new styles of prose and poetry. And postmodernism is deliberately using a mix of conventional styles. So what that does is it often puts the reader off foot, so they think they understand what's happening, and then there's some kind of shift or jumble or mix with a different literary convention that makes you go, oh, okay, I thought the author was doing this, but they're actually doing this. One example of that might be if you've seen the movie or read the book. I'm not really encouraging this. I'm not really recommending this, but Fight Club is a good example of that. You think you understand the direction that it's going, and then there's a massive twist at the end that makes you see that reality, or makes you believe that reality was just completely unreliable, that you can't believe anything that has happened in the movie up to that point. All right, so now that we've looked at some of the differences, let's look at some of the commonalities. You're still going to have a lot of fragmentation in plot, characters, theme, images. The storyline might feel fragmented. It might feel like it doesn't really flow the way you expect a story should. Loss is an extremely important theme. Many characters are experiencing some kind of loss, and that leads to the conflict that they are experiencing. There is the destruction of the family unit left and right. We'll see that in a couple of our stories. I Stand Here Ironing shows us that. Everyday Use shows us that, even though Everyday Use is one of the more conventional stories that we'll read for postmodernism, it is dealing with the destruction of a family unit. All the characters in there are some way, shape, and form dealing with loss. All right, characters may be given little or no physical description, and one or more characters is usually an outcast. While we're talking about Everyday Use, you do see some physical description there because that's important to who these characters are. But you do have a couple of characters who could be considered an outcast. So Maggie, in the beginning of her life, is kind of the outcast, right? She's not as beautiful as her sister. She's not as smart as her sister. But then D comes in from the outside, and it has this way of bonding Mama and Maggie, which makes D the outcast at the end of the story. So authority figures are often untrustworthy, and that reflects sort of this question of truth. If you have this entity, this authoritative figure who is telling you this is the way it is, modernism would say, well, can I trust that? Because if there's no such thing as absolute truth, then this authority figure cannot tell me that this is the way it is. All right, you do have a movement away from religion. Remember that descent into modernism. It doesn't start going back up the stairs in postmodernism. It's staying there at the bottom and kind of reveling in that chaos. And then there is a reversal of traditional roles. Now, you might have, I was going to say you might have seen movies in the 80s. I don't think you guys were born in the 80s. But in the 80s, there were a stream of movies that dealt with kind of this reversal of traditional roles and how that was supposed to be funny, humorous, kind of ridiculous. In fact, Michael Keaton starred in a movie, the name of which I cannot remember, but Daddy Daycare would be a more recent version of that, in which the mother goes to work full-time and the father stays home and takes care of the kids. And in that Michael Keaton movie, the entire thing is about how it's kind of a ridiculous idea that a father would be staying at home with his children. Much more acceptable today. Then it was kind of a novelty, and it was, how is this dad possibly going to deal with all these situations that a woman would usually deal with? All right, I thought I had, I'm so sorry, something about style and method, but we'll talk about that when we talk about individual stories, because we do have 3 or 4 stories in this postmodern literary period. So let's look at some famous works and authors. I think a lot of these have had a resurgence in popularity. So I hope that you have heard at least of 2 or 3 of these. So Joseph Heller's Catch-22, there's been, I think on Amazon Prime, either a show or a movie based on this novel. American Psycho, of course, was a very famous movie early in the century. So Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. I think, no, it was Ken Kesey, but this would be another good example of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then Margaret Atwood, of course, The Handmaid's Tale. You really can't escape it in the last 5 or 6 years. It's kind of everywhere. I've never watched it, but I still know a lot about the plot because it just seems to be everywhere. So these are stories that are based in a certain amount of chaos, based in a certain amount of absurdity, and that along with loss tend to be just a major theme in postmodernism. So as we go through the stories, I'll point out this is an aspect of postmodernism, and this is too. I would say that postmodernism is probably one of the most difficult to get your head around, especially if you are a Christian, because it just seems so much to be the antithesis of what we as Christians actually believe. So we'll handle that kind of on a case-by-case basis.